Hey there, students. Mr. Wolf here, and I hope you're having a great day as we are working asynchronously today. So today, what I have for us is kind of a quick introduction to the world of poetry. So we're kind of answering a couple of questions, why we read it, and how to help understand it a little bit better. Okay, so I'm going to give you a method to use, and it's going to be what you're going to be practicing today for our asynchronous work, just kind of a getting started with things. So let's go ahead and jump into this. So first question is why do we study poetry? I mean, let's be honest, no one just sits and reads poetry anymore unless you're a nerdy teacher like me. I don't know, I do, but whatever. Sometimes. I have some very cherished books, actually. But first off, we've got a couple of quotes here. We have, the poet doesn't invent, he listens. So this is an exercise, I think, that we all take part in some capacity. But it says, poetry is important because it reflects the emotions and character of society. It is a mirror to humanity, just like all literature and fine art. Now, you could look and say, well, but no one really actually listens to poetry or writes it very often. And to which I would say, nay, we do actually, we are surrounded by poetry all the time. It typically takes the form of music. And if we're looking at even historic traditions, that's what poetry mostly is. Most music, most poetry was put to some music and lyric. Even in the the ancient epic stories of Gilgamesh or Odysseus and the Odyssey, those were all epic stories, epic poems that were put to music and were little episodic type things, but they were meant to be listened to and enjoyed as much as understood. So we'll take a look at how that plays out a little bit now. So here's kind of our formula for poetry. We have meaning plus sound plus form is what equals poetry. So we have a collage of images, thoughts, and sounds that evoke feeling and meaning that ultimately help comprise what we consider to be poetry today, okay? So you must look at form, meaning, and sound elements to truly take the meaning from a poem. If you wanted to get down to its most basic element, form itself is like kind of the base ingredient to poetry. There's a lot of different forms out there. You could look at haikus, you could look at limericks, you could look at sonnets, and a whole bunch of other kind of things with meter and rhyme and blah, blah, blah. In the end, form is really what matters, because you can have something like free verse, which has no meter, it has no rhyme, but it has cadence, it has imagery, it has sound, it has emotion in it. And you may have read a book even where you're like, wow, this is a really poetic description of a scene or a person or something like that. And the reason why is because it has all those elements. It has this beauty to it. Or what's called euphony. We're going to talk a little bit more about that going forward, but euphony is this idea of pleasantry of sound, and most poetry that we enjoy has that. Now, there's absolutely poetry out there that has what's called cacophony, right? It's an unpleasantness of sound, and depending on what a poet's attempting to do, they might be using that. So, moving on, let's take a look. So, why is poetry difficult to read and understand? Because I don't know why, but years that I've been teaching poetry, for some weird reason, students shy away from poetry. It's intimidating to them or something along those lines. All I can figure is it's just uncomfortable. It's not something we do very often. But I think what it really comes down to is this concept between denotation and connotation. So any of my Sherlock Holmes fans out there probably know these words, right? So denotation is the literal. It's like, here's what the poem is telling me literally, right? Or what a book or a story is telling me literally. This is what I got of it. It's what's happening, right? And then your English teacher goes, well, there's something more there, though, isn't there? And you're going, oh my gosh, I knew there was. I don't know. I don't look that deep. I'm only kind of on a literal level. What do you want from me, right? That's where the connotation comes in. That's what English teachers are constantly asking people to look for, is what is understood about it, right? And you guys do this all the time. Everybody does this all the time, right? When somebody goes, you're on fire, or that's so sick, right? They're not saying like, oh, they're ill? Like, do I need to, right? If somebody is taking everything literally, right, it would be a very confusing world with the kind of language and slang we have, right? If that's the bomb, okay, we should call someone, 911, we're all going to explode, right? No, oh, that's not what I meant, right? So that's connotation. Those are very simple examples. And when we're dealing with poetry, it obviously gets more complex. So with that said, we'll take a look at how that can play out here. So real quick, let's just take a look at how the meaning kind of plays out. So the denotative literal language might be is a basic strict dictionary meaning of a word or a phrase, whereas the connotative is using language that is not meant to be taken literally but has underlying meaning. So Here's an example. The phrase, "this is my home." Okay, denotatively is this is where I live, I sleep, I eat, this is my shelter from the elements, right? This is what a home is supposed to be. It's the shelter, it's the place I sleep and I take care of, and I've got a mortgage for it and it's expensive, right? Then there's the connotative. When I say this is my home, this is the place that feels natural, that feels safe. This is where my heart belongs. This is where my family lives. This is where I have memories and experiences, right? All of that is the connotative meaning to saying this is my home, right? So even that phrase, like, my home is your home, right? Mi casa es tu casa, whatever it is, right? That's one of those things where it's really saying, like, I share what I have. Everything that's mine is also yours. You're welcome, and that's a hospitality thing, right? There's a connotation to that. It's not like literally this is your house. This is a place you're welcome to stay anytime you want, right? So that's what connotative versus denotative language is, and it can be really confusing. And a lot of poetry employs that. That's what makes poetry kind of like a puzzle. I've always found poetry really interesting because it is looking for what lies beneath and the puzzle and the deeper meaning behind things, and you can encapsulate that, and quite frankly, it's an art form of ideas that I think is really interesting when you're able to find good poetry. I'm hoping that's what we're going to explore a little bit this time. So to do that, we have this term you may have heard before called TPCast. So TPCast is just a method, okay? It is not the end-all of poetry analysis by any means. It is an effective one, though, and it is one worth looking at. So that's what we're going to be employing a little bit here and there through this this brief unit we're going to be exploring. So let's take a look at what TPCast stands for. It's kind of a fancy, weird phrase. It doesn't mean much in its letters, but let's take a look. So first off, we start off with title. Now, a poet may choose the title for any random reason, but in the end, the title can be a key to interpretation. It can be a key also to understanding the poem, right? I mean, the interpretation, or just what the poem is really about. It could be a symbol. It can be a whole bunch of different things. It may not be anything but the first line of the poem because the poet didn't give a title. That's a very frequent thing that happens sometimes. So paraphrasing is the next thing we go to, right? So the first thing you want to do is look at the title. Let's go back to that. Look at the title. What is this poem? Look what it's going to be about. Before you've even read the thing, you just kind of go, okay, what is the title of the poem? What does it tell me about what I expect to probably find in the poem? And so you kind of have this anticipation that you do through exploring that question of what does the title tell me. From there, you have the paraphrase. So what's basically happening in the poem? That's the denotative part. That's where you just go, read the poem. What is it telling me is going on? Is it a story? Is it an emotion? What's going on? I don't know, right? Then there's the connotation. What's the figurative language that exists in the poem? What are the hints and the stylistic elements and the imagery and all those different literary and poetic devices that tell us something else is going on, or like underneath the surface, okay? Attitude. So describe the mood and the tone. Now those two things are very, very similar, but they're not quite the same, right? The tone is kind of the author's voice, right? And their attitude, whereas the mood is kind of like what feelings does it cause in me. Now a lot of those times those things go together, but not always, right? You might get angry when the tone of your author is sarcastic, right? So that's how those things can separate. So then we have shifts. Poetry is known for having shifts, right? You have this thing in, if you've ever studied sonnets, there's this thing called a volta at the end, usually in the last two lines of a Shakespearean sonnet, where what it does is it kind of shifts the tone of what's happening in the poem. So and shift the narrative, or like, hey, we're going to look at this idea from a different angle. So those shifts may come in the form of sound. It may come in the form of structure of the poem. The rhyme scheme may indicate something. We'll take a look at that going forward. Then we have the title. After reading the poem, what does the title mean? Does it have any new meaning? What do I now understand about the title? So it's kind of going back to that and going, okay, let's use that key to see if we can understand anything more. And then ultimately, we want to come up with like a theme. What was the purpose of this poem? What common human experience does this poem explore that we can, wax a little philosophical on, or at least just kind of pinpoint and go, okay, I get it. So let's take a look at that real quick. We're going to look at a poem, a short one, by Dorothy Parker called Interior. So right off the bat, we want to kind of like look at that. But we're just going to read through it, and we'll go through that process super quick, okay? So, interior. Her mind lives in a quiet room, a narrow room and tall, with pretty lamps to quench the gloom, and mottos on the wall. There all things are waxen neat and set in decorous lines, and there are posies round and sweet, and little straightened lines. Her mind lives tidily, apart from cold and noise and pain, and bolts the door against her heart, out wailing in the rain. Oof. Right? Wow, that's a deep poem. Let's break this sucker down, because that's a lot of stuff. I'm not sure what's going on. So, this is the process of me going through the TPCast as an example for you guys, right? I think the poem will be about the inside of something not easily seen, perhaps, comfort, design, right? Interior. What is interior? Interior design. Interior, the inside of something. A good place, cozy, thinking of home. I don't know. Paraphrase. So looking at the rhyme scheme, punctuation, ideas, summarize them to paraphrase a poem. In the poem, the person's mind is personified by being able to live in a beautiful room. It also is well organized and tidy with elements of nature in it. The heart is also personified as it's stuck outside of the beautiful room in a cold and dark environment. Sounds kind of harsh, right? Not making any judgment there. Then we have the connotation. So this is where we get into what's happening beneath. Positive and comforting imagery is offered with words like pretty and decorous and sweet and straightened. However, they are contradicted by words like cold and noise and pain in the second half of the poem. There is a clear metaphor personification of her mind as living in a room, her head a place of imagination, as well as her heart, which is out in the rain. So these things are personified. They kind of are connected to each other. Like there's a separation of those two things. And again, the mind is in a happy place, in a good place, a comfortable place, whereas the heart is not. It's in a terrible place. So this is obviously a state of a person's consciousness and emotions warring against each other somehow. And I can add that a little bit if I wanted to, right? So attitude. The tone is confusion and isolation, and the mood is worried and or fearful, right? So then the question is how, and that's something we come up later. So let's take a look a little bit more of the other stuff. Shift, there's a definite shift in tone in line 9, beginning with the word apart. So that suddenly shifts from being in the mind to being about the cold and the heart out in the rain, right? So there is the sound. When we're looking at the sound, there's end-line rhyme used throughout the poem. There's pleasant at first, but it switches to be more intense in the latter half. The beginning is more euphonic, while at the end is more cacophonic. So the structure, it's one stanza of 12 lines, 6 couplets, and has a meter between 6 and 8 syllables per line. So that was me going through it and just looking at what that is. And now if you're like, I don't remember what couplets are and how to look at all that stuff, that's fine. But what I noticed is that there's kind of a pattern of 6 and 8 syllables. We'll talk about how to look at syllables later. Okay, so that's just a general structure going. It does have structure. It does have kind of a musical element to it, right? So then in title, we can go back to that and go interior. Then we know refers to what's going on in this young girl's mind. It's the interior of her mind, what's going on in her heart and in her mind. So emotionally and mentally, that's the interior. Like whatever we see outside is different, obviously, than what's going on the inside. And it's a war, or definitely very different things going on between the heart and the head. So then there's this theme. Now, the theme, there's a lot of different angles to go with this one. So I want to make sure it's clear that when we're talking about the theme, there's a lot of different directions to go. And I'll give you maybe another one that I would say kind of a variation of what I have here. So there's a common human tendency to not let our emotions impair our judgment and logical decision-making, but there's a fine line between that and living in denial. Because we have a heart, we have a head that's, very, very comfortable and very, logical and everything is well said and organized. And then there's the heart, which is out wailing in the rain. It's like, is this person denying their emotions and using logic, or what's going on? So there's that denial element of it. Now, there's a couple of other ways you could approach this. You may be like, I totally saw this differently. I saw this person who is talking about how her mind and logic doesn't really get harmed, right? It's organized, I can think through things, and it's easy. My heart, though, is constantly battling and constantly wailing and struggling because of whatever issues there are there, right? And maybe it's a matter of how this person takes refuge in their mind when they struggle with something, or they've been denied love, or who knows what, right? Whole bunch of different directions to go at. So what we're going to do this time around, you guys are going to have a poem, and we're going to read that poem, and we're going to apply this TPCast process to it before we move too much further into poetry. Going forward, we are going to be looking a little bit more at other elements, but let's start here, and we'll go from there. So thank you guys for watching. My time is up. I will see you guys next class period. Thanks.